Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Brajajana Ranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Jamunat Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Gopi Janavalabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Brhadajana Ranjana Jamunatira Vanachari Jamunatira Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jaya Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada Jaya, Prabhupada Jaya. Om Rishibadev Bhagavatamrta Maharaj Acharya, also the Śrīmad AC Bhaktivedanta Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai, Namacharya Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem Sagaho, Sri Krishna Chaitanya, Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Advaita Gadadhar, Shivasadi Gaur, Bhaktivedanta Ki Jai, Shri Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopita Shama Kunda, Radha Kunda, Giri Govardhan Ki Jai, Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Navadvip Dham Ki Jai, Gang Jamuna Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai, Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai, Samaveta Bhaktivedanta Ki Jai, Go Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Śrīmate Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswata Deve Gauravani Prachadane Nirvashesha Shunyavadi Paschatade Shatarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaur Bhaktivedanta Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 9, Verse 7. Ta yavyasi dvijasati svagarbhajatam mitunam sapatnya upanyasya swayam anushamstaya patilokam agat. Translation: Thereafter, the Brahmana's younger wife, after entrusting her twin children, the boy and girl, to the elder wife, departed for Patiloka, voluntary dying with her husband. After the father died, the 9 stepbrothers of Jadabharat, who considered Jadabharat dull and brainless, abandoned the father's attempt to give Jadabharat a complete education. The stepbrothers of Jadabharat were learned in the 3 Vedas, the Rig Veda, Sam Veda, and Yajurveda, which very much encourage fruitive activity. The 9 brothers were not at all spiritually enlightened in devotional service to the Lord. Consequently, they could not understand the highly exalted position of Jadabharata. Degraded men are actually no better than animals. The only difference is that animals have 4 legs and such men have only 2. These 2-legged animalistic men used to call Jadabharat mad, dull, deaf, and dumb. They mistreated him, and Jadabharat behaved for them like a madman who was deaf, blind, or dull. He did not protect or try to convince them that he was not so. If others wanted him to do something, he acted according to their desires. Whatever food he could acquire by begging or by wages, and whatever came of its own accord, be it of a small quantity, palatable, stale, or tasteless, he would accept and eat. He never ate anything for sense gratification because he was already liberated from the bodily conception, which induces one to accept palatable or unpalatable food. He was full in the transcendental consciousness of devotional service, and therefore he was unaffected by the dualities arising from the bodily conception. Actually, his body was as strong as a bull's, and his limbs were very muscular. He didn't care for winter or summer, wind or rain, and he never covered his body at any time. He lay on the ground and never smeared oil on his body or took a bath. Because his body was dirty, his spiritual effulgence and knowledge were covered, just as the splendor of a valuable gem is covered by dirt. He only wore a dirty loincloth and his sacred thread, which was blackish. Understanding that he was born in a Brahmin family, people would call him a Brahma Bandhu and other names. Being thus insulted and neglected by materialistic people, he wandered here and there. Purport: Srila Narottam Das Thakur has sung Deha Smriti Nahi Jar Samsara Bandhana Kahantar. One who has no desire to maintain the body, or who is not anxious to keep the body in order, and who is satisfied in any condition, must be either mad or liberated. Actually, Bharat Maharaj, in his birth as Jadabharat, was completely liberated from material dualities. He was a Paramahamsa and therefore did not care for bodily comfort. So, in these verses, we see the description of the activities and qualities of Jada Bharad. And as we see, those qualities can be misinterpreted because the same qualities apply to a madman, and at the same time they also apply to the most exalted spiritual person. So it becomes a little confusing sometimes when we look at these great devotees. And therefore, we're warned that we should not try to judge these devotees at all, because by doing so we commit offense. So what is the quality of these exalted persons? We find scriptural descriptions sometimes of the exalted devotees, and here is a practical description. So, for instance, in the Nectar devotion there, it discusses the different grades of devotees. So we have a person doing sadhana bhakti, we have a person on the stage of bhava, and we have a person on the level of prema. So Rupa Goswami spends quite a lot of time in detailing the qualities and activities of a person doing sadhana bhakti. So he hears and chants and remembers, he does all sorts of activities, etc. And they're quite easy to classify or describe, those activities. When he describes the person on bhav bhakti, he gives, I think, 13 anubhavas or actions or qualities of that devotee, which are also sensible in one sense. He's detached from material things, he's absorbed in chanting the holy name, he's absorbed in hearing about the pastimes of the Lord, he has longing for the Lord. So qualities like that. And then when he describes, he goes to the person in prema, then he describes the how you get to prema and the qualities of prema and generally the definition of prema, etc. But then he just mentions that it's very difficult or impossible to describe the characteristics and activities of a person in prema. So therefore, he doesn't spend, he says one sentence to describe them. After he gives so much descriptions of the person doing sadhana bhakti and a little less for the person doing bhav bhakti. When he comes to the prem bhakti, then he just says one sentence, you cannot describe it. So, in other words, the higher one ascends in the process of bhakti, the more it is difficult to describe that person. And the activities he does may contradict our conception of even of a devotee. And therefore we can't really classify that person at all. We'll find a description also in the Madhurya Kadambini, which describes each stage from Shraddha to sadhana bhakti, bhajana kriya, anartana vritti, nishta, ruchi, asakti, and then bhava, and then prema. So we see as Vishnu Chakravarti begins to describe those different devotees, as we get into from ruchi to asakti, and we get to bhava, and then to prema, the person is more and more absorbed in the pastimes of Krishna, until he's completely absorbed in those pastimes. And consequently, he has no awareness of everything in this material world. So in bhava, it's often like that, and in prema, it's completely like that. So he's unaware of the material world. And therefore, it's very difficult for a person who's in the material world, when he sees him, to understand what he's doing, because he doesn't act like a normal person. He's completely forgotten this world. So here we have an extreme example of this. Bharat Maharaj became Jad Bharat, and then he was determined not to get attached to anything. At the same time, he was completely attached to the Supreme Lord, and therefore he was completely detached from everything. So it describes here Whatever was offered, he would eat. And if nobody offered anything, he didn't eat. And he didn't judge the food, this is good food or bad food. He simply ate it. Yeah? And whatever cloth was there, he would wear that cloth. He would lie on the ground and go to sleep on the ground, very simply. He didn't wash his body. Yeah? And people would talk to him, he wouldn't answer. So they thought he was deaf or dumb or whatever, dull. And therefore they didn't give him much respect. So in this last verse it describes that he was like a jewel covered up by dirt. So no one could understand his exalted spiritual nature. And instead they thought he was just a madman or a dullard or whatever, who had no common sense to even keep his body clean. But actually he was an exalted, great exalted devotee of the Lord. So no one could detect that. We find a similar case with Sukadev Goswami. It was described there in the first canto that he came into the arena of Parikshit Maharaj, and he had no clothing on, and he was followed by women and children who were making fun of him and thinking he was a madman also, because he was just walking around like not talking to anybody. So similar case, completely absorbed in the Lord, and therefore had no concern for his material body or the people of this world. So in the Madhuri Kadambini, there Vishnu Chakravarti describes a little bit of that mentality of the person. He is so absorbed in the Lord that he takes no interest in his family members or society or what they think or the rules of society. Not because he wants to disturb people, but simply because he's absorbed in relishing the Supreme Lord. So it's not that he's deliberately harassing people or whatever, but rather he's simply so absorbed in the Lord that he's unaware of his physical surroundings or society and the obligations to society. So that's a very exalted stage. So we cannot imitate that stage artificially. Some people may do that to get respect or to get worship or to get fame. And people will say, oh, he's such a great yogi because he's so detached from everything, standing on one leg or whatever like that. So people may perform great austerities or whatever to get worship and respect from people. But that is not the intention here. These exalted devotees are not trying to be austere to get respect from anybody. Just the opposite. They have no awareness of other people at all. So a very exalted stage. So people who are not on the stage should not imitate that, which is usually imitation for personal profit. So rather, we have a gradual process of detachment from the material world. So this is called sahaj vairagya, or natural renunciation. So that means that we don't artificially renounce things, but we have certain rules for engaging our senses and using our senses in this material world. We also call this yukta vairagya, detachment by engagement of the senses. And so instead of stopping the senses from eating or sleeping or whatever, we engage the senses. How do we can do that without developing material attachment? We engage the senses for Krishna. So the more we can engage our senses for Krishna, then the less we are engaging our senses in Maya. So then this is a good way in which we can progress in spiritual life. So we engage our senses as much as possible in the service of Krishna, and consequently less opportunity for engagement in Maya. So when we engage the senses in Krishna, it is not a material activity. It's devotional service. It is bhakti. And bhakti destroys all contamination and all karma. It doesn't create karma, it destroys it. So this is the unique nature of activities of bhakti. They don't create karma, but they destroy karma. And normal activities create more karma. That's all they do. But the activities of bhakti destroy karmas completely. Plus, they increase our bhakti. They increase our attraction to Krishna. So this is the process by which we advance. And when one advances into bhava and prema, then naturally one becomes completely detached and one may act in this manner. However, at this stage, there are some persons who are very high, but they don't act like this. So we see exalted devotees like Dhruva or Parikshit or Yudhisthira and Pandavas. They were in prema, but they were not like this, wandering around in the street. So Yudhisthira was the king. Parikshit was a king. They did not renounce. So that is also a possibility that sometimes the great devotees, even though they're very attracted and absorbed in the Lord, they may struggle, with some struggle, maintain the normal appearance of being normal in this world. Why would they do this? To teach people. So therefore it is said that some devotees, they're not really attached to doing all these duties in material life, karma yoga and all of this, but they do it to teach other people that they should not artificially try to renounce. They should go through the gradual process. And so therefore, if they're not qualified for bhakti, they do karma yoga. So the great devotees sometimes teach people by that. And Krishna himself does so. So he also teaches people in the same way by following regular dharma, etc., and acting like a king, even though he doesn't have to do that. So therefore, some exalted devotees who are completely attached to the Lord and in prema, they may act not like this, but like ordinary devotees on a lower level even. But, so we should not mistake them on that. Oh, look, they're obliged to do all these things, so they're kanishtas or whatever like that. No, they're very exalted, but they're doing that simply to teach other people. That's all. So those who are not at that level, those who are not at bhava or prema, that is, they are doing sadhana, then they should not act like this. They should be following normal conduct in society, etc., in most cases. But still, even then we have those who are renounced. They may not be at prema or bhava, but they have a tendency for renunciation or detachment. So therefore, they're not involved in family life. They do not get married. So we have, on the one hand, sannyasis, or in Lord Chaitanya's movement, we have the Babajis. So they are supposed to be qualified by detachment. They may not be at the highest level of bhakti, but they have some detachment, and so they practice a renounced way of life, which may be somewhat similar to this, not completely, but somewhat similar to this also. But they're not at that highest level. But that's not so common. So therefore, most of the devotees of Lord Chaitanya do not renounce. They were practicing household life. So if you read Chaitanya Charitamrta and you see the lists of all those devotees, most of them were grihastas, living in Navadvip or in parts of Bengal or in Puri or wherever. And they had their occupation, whatever it was, Brahmins or Vaishya or Kshatriya or whatever, carried out their regular duties, raised their families, and they were also devotees of the Lord. Of course, many of those also were on the level of prema. But they were carrying out, again, their regular duties to help people. But other than those, then we have the regular devotees who also carry out their activities in a similar manner. So they do not artificially renounce everything. And they practice devotional service and go on with their activities of this world. So what are those activities they follow? They follow the activities of the Varnashram system. But sometimes the activities of the Varnashram system may not be so favorable to bhakti. So we have worship of devatas, worship of pitras, and things like this, encouragement of increasing your family members and enjoying nicely in this material world and going to Svargaloka, things like this. So that's not encouraging for bhakti at all. So therefore those elements of the Varnashram system are not encouraged. Rather, worship of Supreme Lord is encouraged, rather than worship of devatas or pitras or whatever. And no goal of trying to enjoy in the material world, rather the goal is Krishna prema. So the devotee can follow that system of Varnashram, but he doesn't get involved in the goals, the material goals of the Varnashram system, artha and kama. And instead tries to offer everything to the Supreme Lord and make it devotional. So in that way, the household devotee can carry out his life and progress in bhakti, and same time not have to renounce everything. So that's the general system of in the Lord Chaitanya's movement. No artificial renouncing, but according to qualification. And the process of bhakti is open for everybody, and it's effective for everyone. So there's no pressing need to artificially renounce. So here, the example of Brhad is here, not to encourage people to renounce in this way, but to show his complete absorption in the Supreme Lord. And we don't try to imitate that. There's also the story of Rishibadev. So Rishibadev also was something like this. He was like a stone. He would just sit there. And if food came, he would eat. If it didn't come, he didn't eat. He didn't respond to people like this. So he is famous because he inspired the Jains, who also practice this type of austerities and whatever like that. However, again, this is not something that everybody is encouraged to do. Everybody cannot renounce in the same way. So it's artificial that people take to the practice of acting like a stone and when they're not qualified to do so. So therefore, it's not a process for everybody. So Rishibadev himself actually is an incarnation of the Supreme Lord, but he's setting that example for a few people, not for everybody. So therefore, when we read these stories, we have to understand them in their proper context. So the as I said, one may mistake an advanced devotee because he does not act according to the normal modes. So someone like Brhad did not follow the rules of the Varnashram system. His father could not teach him anything. And it says here, well, he had a Brahman thread because his father put it on him and he didn't take it off, but it was all black. And he never took a bath. He never washed himself. So the Brahmana is supposed to wash at least 3 times a day, bathe himself completely and whatever. And he didn't wash himself ever. Never changed his thread, never washed his body, never did anything. So he was completely different from a normal person, and therefore people said he is a Brahma Bandhu, he's a fallen Brahmana. And this is that was said to criticize him as being very unqualified person. later it is said that they didn't find any use for him, so they put him out in the fields as a scarecrow to keep the birds away from the crops. So people disrespected him. Even his own brothers disrespected him. When his father was alive, his father protected him. When his father passed away, then his brothers were there, and they had no respect at all, and they simply thought he's just a madman or whatever. But nevertheless, he was very exalted, but they could not see that, even though they were brothers and intimately associated with him. So this indicates that it may be difficult to see the exalted devotee and appreciate him, especially if we're not closely associating with them. Even when they closely associated with Bharat, Jad Bharat, they couldn't understand who he was. His brothers, his own brothers. So, therefore, that's why Rupa Goswami always says we cannot describe him, and therefore you should not judge such a person. And we may, if we start judging, we may find fault. So we can criticize Jad Bharat, why he doesn't take a bath. Because that's you have to take a bath. You have to be clean. It's the rule of bhakti, sadhana bhakti. You have to take a bath, and he's not taking a bath. Therefore, how can he be a devotee? So from our gross viewpoint, then we may criticize in many ways. Not only Jad Bharat, but others as well. Even Nityananda Prabhu, he's called Avadut, which means it's similar. Avadut means similar type of person, unpredictable what he'll do. And he may break the conventions of the Varnashram system, he may not act in the ordinary way. There's rules to follow. He doesn't follow the rules. So that was also Nityananda Prabhu. And then people may criticize also. So therefore we have to be very careful. But it says this is rather rare to find such a person. But nevertheless, you have to be very, very careful that we don't in any way criticize or offend those exalted devotees simply because of our blindness. We don't understand their nature. The same can even be applied to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, if we look at him as he progressed in life after he grew up, and then he was teaching, and then he got his diksha, and then he became more and more involved in doing kirtan. And then he took sannyas, and then he went to Puri. And all along, his ecstasies kept increasing and increasing. And when he was in Puri, then as he stayed there, again, the ecstasies increased and increased. His absorption in the pastimes of Radha and Krishna kept increasing. And consequently, his awareness of the material world completely was absent in many cases. So then people may also think, oh, Lord Chaitanya is a madman, because sometimes he'll be shouting, and sometimes he's dancing, sometimes he's crying, sometimes he's falling on the ground like a madman. So, of course, the devotees of Lord Chaitanya understood his ecstasy and prema, but others look at him, they think, oh, this is the madman. In this, of course, the Supreme Lord himself acting like this. If we can mistake the Supreme Lord for a madman, what to speak of just a regular devotee who's attained prema, and we'll think he's a madman also. So we should not always go by the externals. But, of course, such a person is also quite rare. Very rare to find such an exalted person around. So, on the lower level, we have our regular devotees doing sadhana bhakti, and they are expected to conform to certain rules and regulations. Some devotees say, well, I'm beyond that. But usually they're below that if they're not following. So we have rules and regulations to follow, and these are for our advantage, for our benefit. So by following these rules, we can advance in devotional service. The person who's on prema, of course, may not follow these rules at all, as in the case here we see Jad Bharat not bathing and whatever, not talking to anyone properly. But for one doing sadhana bhakti, then we follow all these different rules of cleanliness and rules of conduct, Vaishnava etiquette, etc., we have a whole set of rules to follow. And if you don't follow those rules, then one gets criticized. So those persons, he can't give the excuse, well, I'm on this level here, and therefore you can't criticize me because I'm an exalted devotee of Brhad. No. On sadhana, so we have to follow those rules on the level of sadhana. We're obliged to follow them. However, as one advances, some of the rules may not be so important anymore. So as one goes through Nishtha to Ruchi to Asakti, then again, that devotee may forget to do some of these rules, and then people start criticizing him also. But that's because he's more advanced, and these rules are no longer important. So again, we have to be a little bit careful with criticizing those devotees. But nevertheless, most of the devotees are not in that level, so therefore they should be following the rules, the standards properly. And if they're not coming up to the standard, then it's a sign of some sort of weakness in their devotional service. So we should be careful in judging people. We have to somewhat be able to judge their spiritual status, and therefore, based on that, then we can criticize or not criticize. Okay, any question there?
Did Bharat take the shelter of a spiritual master?
It doesn't really describe, even when he is Bharat, about his guru or anything, but we do assume he did have a guru when he was Bharat, king, etc., because generally they did get some, at least the priest was there, and they get some sort of spiritual guidance or whatever. And then he became a deer. As a deer, he had no guru, obviously. And then he became Jad Bharat. So the only guru he had was his father, who gave him the Gayatri mantra. So in that sense, there is some sort of Vedic diksha given to him. But then he didn't want to chant the mantra properly. He refused to chant the Om Bhurbuva Svaha, even, do that properly. So he couldn't even get proper Vedic diksha, what to speak of Vaishnava diksha. But it appears in many periods of time previously. This is actually from Swayambhuva Manvantara period, somewhere in that, quite millions of years ago. Sometimes the Vaishnava Diksha wasn't there, but they did have the Vedic Diksha, which is the Upanayanam, getting the Gayatri Mantra, etc. So the father tried to give him, so technically he was like the guru, but he wasn't a very good disciple because he couldn't chant the mantra. But because he was so advanced, we can say that was not really necessary. So the diksha was not really necessary. Of course, then we can say, well, they should have had shiksha, but we don't see anybody around there to give him shiksha. But we do understand that he had reached the stage of bhava when he was Bharat. So again, he had already got some shiksha previous to that. So we can assume that this is a carryover from, because he had memory of his previous life also, probably, a little bit. At least the influence was there. So therefore, he had already accrued all knowledge anyway through as Bharat, etc. So, but again, it's an exceptional case.
In Jainism, sometimes we see people, celebration where people renounce and they throw diamonds on the streets and all the positions. And
the son becomes a mendicant.
Yeah.
And then they have a huge party. And
yes.
Yeah.
So in that case, how far can we say there is a true renunciation, or what is the cause of the renunciation there?
In that case?
Yeah.
Well, it's not that he's getting the diamonds, it's the parents that are celebrating it, that's all. So, which is, in one sense, maybe good, because usually it's the opposite, isn't it? If somebody renounces, you lock them up in the room and don't let them go. So if they're willing to let them go and practice spiritual life, that's maybe a good sign. But maybe it's a little extravagant that they celebrate in such a way, but at least it's a sign that they do recognize that advancement in spiritual life is more important than just living as a householder and enjoying in the material world. So that's a good aspect of it.
Maharaj, you said that Bharat Maharaj, he acted like a dumb, blind and like just like unique person, like he didn't reply and he was ill-treated by everyone and he didn't react. So we Kali Jivas, like we are sometimes ill-treated or mistreated by many people, like friends or like just other people. So then how do we react to such situations?
What, if we're treated like Jad Bharat was treated? How do we react?
Yeah.
Oh, well, of course we don't act deaf and blind and whatever like him, but Lord Chaitanya teaches us that Trinadapi Sunichena Torapi Sahishnuna, that we should be humbler than a blade of grass and more tolerant than a tree. So if we get mistreated by others, we shouldn't get too upset. That's tolerance, like the tree. So the tree is growing, and then people come along and pull off the branches, or they pick the fruit or the leaves, and the tree does not complain. It just accepts it. And if the wind blows, it blows the tree this way and that way, the tree does not complain. So in the material world, we get treated nicely or mistreated somehow, disrespected by others. And that's to be expected because it's the material world, and not every situation is perfect. So we can expect to have all sorts of different problems from living entities and human beings and even the weather or whatever, accidents and all this. But we should try to be peaceful in all these conditions, recognizing it's due to our material situation, material body, and law of karma operating. So we tolerate it. Yeah.
Hare Krishna. Maharaj, the story of Jad Bharat just trails off. So do we understand he went back to Godhead?
Well, yeah, because he was very advanced in prema. And probably the last we hear about him is that, that he taught Rahugana, King Rahugana, and he gave him some very good instructions. So even though he was so detached from the world, he became very compassionate suddenly. So that shows his exalted nature also, that though he was so hidden and detached from everything, he was willing to give great mercy to someone who actually offended him, insulted him quite badly, made him carry his palanquin and everything. But nevertheless, somehow Jad Bharat was very, very merciful. So that shows the great nature of the devotee, that he was very, very compassionate.
And also with Yudhishthir Maharaj, personalities like Prahlada, Yudhishthir, were they on the platform of Krishna Prema Bhakti?
Oh yeah. Well, actually, the Pandavas are eternal associates of the Lord. And they have their own place up in the spiritual world also. So, and all these stories about they had to see hell and this and that after they went up to Himalayas and passed out of the Bible. This is kind of superficial story, but actually they're eternal associates of the Lord, so they don't have to experience hell or anything like that. So that's how we should understand the intimate associates of Krishna, very, very elevated devotees, and I mean Nitya Siddhas in most cases.
Maharaj, here Jada Bharat acting dumb, dull. We see in our teachings also that a disciple should remain like a fool in front of a spiritual master. And we tell this Mukham Karoti Vachalam, the verse, and Mahaprabhu saying, my spiritual master told that I'm like a fool in this mantra he gave. So what that exactly mean, that a disciple should remain like a fool in front of a spiritual master?
Well, that's a little bit different, because also we say that the the disciples should be pariprashna. He should be inquisitive. So if you ask all to be a fool and ask all the wrong questions, Guru's not going to appreciate that very much. So we have to be a little intelligent and ask questions as well. So we can't be foolish in that sense and just be materialistic. But what it does mean, it means that we understand that we have no knowledge. And therefore we're very humble. And if we think we do have knowledge, we cannot be humble. So in that sense, we're a fool, we're unqualified or whatever. So when we say that we are, like Rupa and Sanatana when they came to Lord Chaitanya with grass in their teeth, so to speak. So we are, ignorant and this and that. Actually, they weren't, because they were very knowledgeable. They had studied Bhagavatam when they were children. And they were great devotees already, but they said we're all fallen, ignorant, useless. So that's the proper attitude to have if we want to accept knowledge from another person. We have to have that humble attitude. So that is when it says pranipat, pranipatena. So pat means to fall down. Like patita, he's a fallen person. So pat means to fall down. And nipat means to fall downwards. And pra means extremely. So it means completely fall down, not only physically but mentally as well. So that puts us in a lower position, which means very humble. So of course physically we do that, we do namaskars, but then mentally when you do the namaskar, the mind has to go down also. So it's not just the body, it's the voice also. You say your pranam prayer and your mind also has to go down. So we have to be humble physically also and mentally, like that. Of course, that operates spiritually also, because then we're Nitya Krishna Das. So if we don't accept that, we don't have any faith, then we can't even start the process of bhakti or get any answers from the spiritual master, because we don't accept the basic principle that we're not the master or the servant, then nothing can happen. So naturally we must be in that position of feeling ourselves unqualified. We see in surrender that surrender has 6 parts, like to accept what is favorable, reject what is unfavorable, and then one of the last ones is this karpanya, which means misery, to feel oneself very fallen and miserable and low like this. Another way of saying that is dainya, to feel dina, very unqualified like that. So that's the natural part of surrender, which Jiva Goswami says is the first anga of bhakti. In Nectar Devotion it's put quite far up, and the main ones are, hearing, chanting, association, living in the holy dham, like that, worshipping the deity, but, and then Sharanagati is later on. But Jiva Goswami in Bhakti Sandarbha puts, of all the angas, he puts this Sharanagati at the first. He says, this is the first anga of bhakti. If you don't do this, you can't do anything. And part of that is this idea of great humility and dainya. And later on in Jiva Goswami, Sanatana Goswami in the Śrīmad Bhāgavatamrta, then he notes at the end, near the end, when he's describing the exalted position of the gopis, he says, the exalted devotees have dainya. And the more they advance, the more it becomes prominent. So the most advanced devotees are the gopis, so they have the most humility, they have the most dainya. So they always consider themselves the most fallen and completely unqualified for Krishna. So that's there in the highest devotees. So it gradually manifests more and more. So it's, you can say, an essential element of bhakti itself, that feeling. So if we don't have anything in the beginning, we're not going to have it at the end also, but it's essential. So therefore it's an essential part of bhakti itself. Yeah. So, foolishness doesn't mean in that sense. On the other hand, we say that you have to be inquisitive and you have to get knowledge. And the whole purpose of Guru ultimately is to give you knowledge So if you don't want to accept that knowledge, you're incapable of accepting it, then you can't be a disciple. Because without that knowledge, you can't advance. We have diksha and we have shiksha. So the shiksha is the important element. And if we don't get that knowledge, then how we can do anything in devotional service? If we can't distinguish Krishna from devatas or Krishna from material beings, if we can't distinguish the Atma from the body, if we can't distinguish pure bhakti from mixed bhakti, if we can't make these distinctions, then we can't really advance in devotional service. So we do have to have intelligence also. But we're never proud of the intelligence. Okay.
That means like if we are happy and we have everything, that means he doesn't favor us. And on the same side,
And
like
if
how
everything gets taken away, then he's more merciful.
Yeah, so what that verse actually means, I just want to...
Well, in some cases, if Krishna finds that your material assets are an obstacle to your bhakti and you're overly attached, then he may take them away. You take everything away, and then you're left with nothing, and then you surrender completely. But that's not, an inevitable principle or an eternal principle that Krishna takes everything away from everybody. But of course, it's in common folklore. Well, I guess maybe it's there in like South India. They say Krishna plays his flute and takes away all your money. It blows all your money away or something like that. So don't put a picture of Krishna in your house because all your money will go away. And it's not inevitable. We see the opposite. Krishna gives everything. Dhruva got the whole world to rule, and then he went up to Dhruva Loka as well. So he didn't get anything taken away from him. He got more and more. He got the kingdom that he wanted. We see that Gajendra was praying, release me from the crocodile, and the Lord came in and released him from the crocodile. He didn't ignore it and said, okay, this is your karma. He released him. So the Lord, and people, one of the types of devotees is the one who wants money, one who is suffering, and he prays to the Lord, get rid of my suffering. Now I need some wealth, and prays to Krishna. So the Lord responds to that often. And if they are suffering, he relieves their suffering. If they need money, he gives them money. Of course, that's mixed bhakti, but he responds to all sorts of devotees in different ways according to their particular needs, and so that they can advance in devotional service. So it's not that he takes everything away from everybody all the time. Certain cases may be necessary for their advancement, so therefore he'll do that. In other cases, if he takes it away, they may not advance in devotional service also. They become the opposite. And their faith is broken and they leave devotional service, so he won't do it in that case.
Prabhuji, who was called Avadut, what was the name of that devotee?
Nityananda.
No,
Yeah.
like, there
So
was a
he was very irregular in his conduct. In fact, as described, he would sometimes run around naked, and then he would sit on Srivas Pandit's wife's lap like a baby. And drink her milk or something like this, Or if he'd go into a liquor shop, and then everyone thought, oh, he's going to get drunk. But actually he was going to preach, like that. Or he would jump into the Ganga and play with the crocodiles, or do all sorts of things, outlandish things, And people couldn't predict what he was going to do next. Okay, Hare Krishna.